Hey guys, tonight we are going to explore a chilling historical story about how absolute power can corrupt a person. In the annals of human history, there are names spoken with admiration, but there are also names tied to a long trail of blood. Henry VIII of England is one of the most haunting cases. He didn't need to shed blood to seize the throne. He inherited it as a gift from fate. However, what he did afterwards with that gift of unlimited power is what transformed him from a golden prince of the Renaissance into a tyrant whose every decision was measured in human lives. Just hearing his name is enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone familiar with his reign. Today, we will delve into the life of Henry VIII, obsession, execution, and the gruesome death of a villain. We will decode the big question: why did a tall, handsome, athletic Tudor king turn into an obese man, weighing hundreds of pounds, addicted to excessive eating, and famous for the nickname the King, who liked to behead his wives? What were the causes that made his obsession with having a male heir so cruel, leading him to marry 6 times yet ultimately fail to achieve his desired outcome? We will examine the causes, consequences, and the personal tragedy behind this downfall. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we begin, I'm always curious to know how far our community reaches. Please comment and let me know where you are in the world and what your local time is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When Henry Tudor formally ascended the throne in the year 1509, adopting the regnal name Henry VIII, England was scarred by decades of dynastic conflict collectively known as the Wars of the Roses. This protracted struggle, which raged intermittently from 1445 to 1487, pitted 2 branches of the royal Plantagenet family against one another, the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. Lords and knights changed banners in the blink of an eye. Castles and towns shifted allegiance at the turn of a season, and the common folk bore the brunt of shifting loyalties in the form of pillage, famine, and the ever-present spectre of violence. Battles such as Towton, with its frozen fields awash in crimson, and Wakefield, where betrayal and bloodshed became legend, left entire counties depopulated and dreamlike palaces reduced to smouldering ruins. In the wake of this internecine horror, the Tudors emerged first Henry VII, who claimed the throne by right of conquest and wedded Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses, thereby ending the bitter feud. Yet peace proved fragile. Memories of betrayals and executions lingered like ash in the wind, and England's heart still throbbed with the tension of recent nightmares. Into this uneasy, calm-stepped young Henry Tudor, tall and athletic, schooled in the humanist arts, and fluent in Latin, French, and the nuances of courtly etiquette. His very bearing, broad-shouldered, keen-eyed, and courteous, offered the promise of stability in a land desperate for both continuity and renewal. The nascent House of Tudor, though bolstered by the favourable union of York and Lancaster, remained new and not yet beyond reproach. Nobles whispered about hidden Yorkist claimants. The common people murmured prayers that their sons would not be conscripted into yet another fratricidal war. Henry VIII, sensing these anxieties, resolved from the outset to project an image of benevolence and grandeur. His court became a stage for splendour. Tapestries spun with mythic scenes, jousting tournaments glittering in morning sunbeams, and feasts attended by scribes and troubadours alike, all assembled to celebrate the dawn of a new era. Yet beneath this opulence lay a darker ambition. Henry was determined that his reign would not merely echo the cautionary tale of his forebears, but outshine it entirely. He sought to transcend the label of peacemaker and carve his name into the bedrock of history. Every decree he issued, every patronage he bestowed, every sumptuous pageant held in his honour functioned as a brushstroke in the grand portrait he painted of himself, a monarch destined for greatness. To achieve this, he drew upon both the traditions of chivalry and the burgeoning innovations of Renaissance governance. He studied treaties as diligently as he practiced falconry. He held audiences with ambassadors by day and discoursed with poets and philosophers by candlelight. Yet, those who thrived under his early favour discovered that loyalty was only as enduring as the king's needs. A courtier might rise swiftly on the tide of Henry's attention, only to find himself cast aside when a new intrigue beckoned. Alliances were as fluid as the ink used to record them. Friendships were trumped by expedience, and the slightest whisper of dissent could result in a sudden fall from grace. In these opening years, the echoes of the Wars of the Roses still reverberated in every shadowy corner of the realm. Henry's keen intelligence and physical prowess inspired hope that he might shepherd England toward lasting stability. But his unquenchable thirst for renown and the reputation of being the greatest king the world had known hinted at a perilous path. A ruler who seeks immortality on earth may inadvertently sow the seeds of discord he so desperately wishes to eradicate. The very keystone of every choice Henry made was the burning ambition to sire a male heir. In the 16th century, the legitimacy of a crown hinged entirely on unbroken male succession. Without a son to follow, a dynasty risked collapse. Consequently, Henry VIII entered into 6 marriages, treating each queen almost as a dynastic experiment. If she failed to bear him a strong young prince, she was deemed to have failed her most sacred duty and was swiftly removed. This obsession shaped all his grand and subtle decisions, from matrimonial alliances to wrenching religious reforms and ruthless purges. Henry's first marriage to Katherine of Aragon was designed to cement the alliance between England and Spain. Katherine, learned and pious, had previously been wed to Henry's elder brother Arthur. Their union, blessed by papal dispensation, endured nearly 2 decades. Yet Katherine bore only one surviving child, Princess Mary, and no son to secure the Tudor line. Convinced that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, Henry demanded an annulment. When Pope Clement VII refused, the king bristled with indignation. No earthly power would override his will. He severed England's ties with Rome, setting himself up as supreme head of the Church of England in 1534. That declaration was more than political maneuvering. It embodied Henry's extraordinary thirst for supreme power. By proclaiming himself head of the Church, he claimed the authority to enact laws, dispense rewards, punish dissenters, and even dictate the spiritual fate of his subjects. Anyone who refused to acknowledge his supremacy faced execution without recourse. Thomas More, once Chancellor and a paragon of integrity, was beheaded in 1535 for his refusal to accept the king's new ecclesiastical status. More's death reverberated across Europe, signalling that no man, no matter how exalted, could stand in Henry's way. The benefits of securing a male heir were twofold. It ensured dynastic continuity and warded off external threats. A kingdom without a son invited foreign intervention, as rival claimants Norman, Plantagenet, or York might press their assertions. Moreover, continental powers such as France or the Holy Roman Empire could exploit any vacancy, fueling insurrections under the guise of restoring legitimate succession. Henry understood that a robust young prince at his side would not only cement the Tudor legacy, but also deter enemies and reassure both nobles and commoners of a stable future. Yet the costs of this obsession were tragic. To procure a son, Henry shattered religious unity, betrayed lifelong friends, and dispatched queens and trusted advisors to violent ends. Katherine of Aragon, once cherished, was cast aside. Her name struck from the roll of queens, her daughter Mary declared illegitimate. England relinquished centuries of spiritual allegiance to Rome, unleashing decades of theological upheaval. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands confiscated, and sold to replenish the royal coffers. Parish churches lost treasured manuscripts and stained glass windows, while the slow rhythms of monastic prayer vanished. Every failed attempt tightened the vice around Henry's heart, fueling a paranoia that blotted out mercy. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, met the scaffold in 1536, accused of adultery and treason under charges almost certainly fabricated. Jane Seymour, the third queen, finally bore him a son, Prince Edward, in 1537, only to die of childbirth complications 12 days later. She became both his triumph and his sorrow, her death prompting genuine grief but also deepening his compulsion to secure a living heir. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, escaped an execution but was quickly set aside when the marriage proved politically expedient yet personally unfulfilling. Katherine Howard, his fifth, was barely 20 when charges of past indiscretions and perhaps imagined unfaithfulness led to her beheading in 1542. Each union, each dissolution, deepened the well of Henry's obsession and pushed him further toward tyranny. Under the mantle of supreme head, Henry wielded religious authority with ruthless efficiency. Clergy and laity alike had to conform to new doctrines or face dire consequences. Dissenting bishops were deposed, holy relics destroyed, and traditional liturgies supplanted by royal edicts. The dissolution of the monasteries brought a flood of wealth into the crown's coffers, but at the expense of the social safety nets that had supported the poor, the sick, and the elderly. Hospitals and schools under monastic care vanished, leaving many destitute. Beyond England's shores, Henry's obsession altered diplomatic landscapes. Other monarchs viewed his break with Rome as both scandalous and dangerous. Alliances shifted as continental powers hesitated to support a king who defied the universal church. England found itself increasingly isolated, dependent on new alliances with Protestant principalities in the German lands. Alliances forged not from genuine religious kinship, but from mutual convenience against common Catholic adversaries. Internally, the wind of change reshaped social structures. The gentry class, enriched by the sale of monastic lands, gained newfound influence, while traditional nobility struggled to maintain their ancestral estates. Peasants faced rising rents and uncertain tenure, fueling unrest in rural communities. The very fabric of English society was rewoven to serve Henry's dynastic aims, often at the lowest cost to the most vulnerable. As Henry's life drew on, the relentless pursuit of a male heir etched deep lines of desperation into his visage. His evenings, once filled with music and revelry, became haunted by anxieties of succession. He feared the crown slipping from his grasp, and the Tudor legacy dissolving into chaos. Even as his body deteriorated under the weight of chronic illness, the flicker of hope for another son never fully died. Thus we see Henry VIII consumed by one imperative: to secure a son, to fulfill the Tudor dream of unbroken male lineage. Every marriage, every decree, every act of mercy or brutality flowed from this singular desire. His dynasty's future and England's destiny hinged upon the birth of a boy. But the path he carved in pursuit of that child revealed a truth more profound and more troubling: that when the hunger for power becomes absolute, it can consume both the seeker and the realm he seeks to preserve. Freed from the bonds of the Roman Curia, Henry VIII swiftly abused his newly claimed divine prerogative to punish anyone who dared to question his authority. Thomas More, the English humanist philosopher and former Lord Chancellor, stands as the most poignant example of this ruthless crackdown. Born on the 7th of February in 1478 in London, More was the son of a prosperous lawyer, groomed from childhood for public service, and steeped in the classical learning of Greek and Latin. His early years saw him excel at Oxford, where he became known for his quick wit, moral integrity, and deep devotion to Catholic theology. By the year 1523, More had risen through the ranks of the legal profession to become Speaker of the House of Commons, and in 1529 he was appointed Lord Chancellor, the King's chief minister in matters both civil and ecclesiastical. During his tenure, he demonstrated a remarkable skill for reconciling the demands of royal authority with his own commitment to justice and virtuous governance. He reformed the Court of Chancery, curbed corrupt practices among local officials, and championed the rights of ordinary citizens against the abuses of powerful barons. Scholars across Europe lauded his best-selling book, Utopia, published in 1531, which explored ideals of governance, communal property, and religious tolerance, a work that remains a cornerstone of Western political thought. Yet when Henry VIII chose to sever England's allegiance to the papacy, Thomas More refused to bend. For More, allegiance to the Roman pontiff was a matter of conscience and divine law, not a mere political convenience. He could not, in good faith, recognise Henry as supreme head of the Church of England, nor could he endorse the annulment of the king's marriage to Katherine of Aragon. Despite entreaties from friends and threats from the crown, More held fast to his convictions, thinking that the separation would endanger the very soul of the realm. In the summer of 1535, More was charged with high treason under the statute that made it a crime to refuse the king's ecclesiastical supremacy. His trial, held at Westminster Hall, lasted scarcely 2 days. The indictment relied on a single statement of denial and a refusal to take the oath of supremacy, a formality that now carried mortal consequences. Witnesses were coerced, testimony was contradictory, and the jury was chosen for its loyalty to the crown. On the 6th of July, 1535, the Lord Chancellor was convicted. 5 days later, on Tower Hill, More mounted the scaffold in a simple black coat, declaring he died, "the king's good servant, but God's first." With that final act of defiance, his head fell to the axe, an event that sent shockwaves through courts and universities across Europe. More's martyrdom did more than silence a single voice. It entrenched Henry's transformation of England's spiritual landscape. In declaring himself head of the newly established Church of England, the king not only wielded temporal power, but assumed complete spiritual authority. The Church of England henceforth answered to the throne alone. Bishops were appointed by royal decree. The Book of Common Prayer replaced the Latin liturgy, and monasteries were dissolved under the guise of royal visits to assess monastic corruption. Properties once held by abbots and priors were seized, enriching the crown and its favourites, while the poor previously cared for by monastic hospitals found themselves bereft of that pastoral safety net. This reconstituted national church became both a tool of statecraft and an instrument of ideological control. Royal proclamations dictated which sacraments could be administered, which clerics could preach, and which prayers could be uttered. Any deviation was deemed heresy or treason, punishable by fines, imprisonment, or death. The king thus stood as God's representative on earth, empowered to interpret scripture, annul marriages, and override any doctrine he found inconvenient. Under this system, local parishes grew accustomed to the king's mandates, altering their weekly worship to align with royal edicts. The Great Bible, printed in English and chained to the lecterns of every church, proclaimed the monarch's new order in the vernacular. Schoolmasters taught the royal supremacy as an article of faith. Meanwhile, dissenting voices, recusant Catholics who held Mass in secret, or reformers who pushed for further Protestant change, faced interrogation by ecclesiastical courts, confiscation of goods, and exile. Thus, the Church of England emerged, not as a purely theological reform, but as a comprehensive political structure, consolidating Henry's control over both crown and conscience. The king's divine prerogative became a living reality. In every cathedral, in every parish, his will echoed as the unassailable voice of God's ordained ruler. What began as a bid for a male heir and as a means to an annulment culminated in a revolution of faith that reshaped the soul of England. Through the martyrdom of Thomas More, the price of dissent was starkly illustrated, and the new national church stood as testament to the king's unbounded authority. In that sombre era, loyalty to crown and country came to demand unwavering fealty, for in England's reforged spiritual framework, to question the monarch was to risk one's very life. The burning desire for a son led Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn, a young woman of vivacious spirit, believed capable of bearing him a prince. Anne was born circa 1501 into an English noble family, deeply entwined with the Tudor court. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a seasoned diplomat and courtier who served on missions in France and the Netherlands. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, hailed from the illustrious Howard lineage, endowing Anne with noble blood on both sides. Within her family, Anne received a rigorous education. She mastered French, Latin, classical literature, and the refined arts of music and dance subjects seldom granted to women of her era. Anne spent her youth at continental courts, first serving Queen Claude of France and later Princess Mary Tudor, Henry's elder sister. There she perfected royal etiquette, absorbed Renaissance humanist ideals, and honed her talents for negotiation and charismatic presence. Her lithe beauty, bright eyes, and mischievous smile enchanted all who met her. Yet Anne's appeal extended beyond appearance. Her sharp intellect, quick wit, and fearless temperament marked her as a woman unwilling to submit to mere authority. Upon returning to England in the early 1530s, Anne began to captivate the attention of Henry VIII, who was then desperate to secure an annulment of his marriage to Katherine of Aragon. Over several years, Henry pursued Anne in secret, showering her with poetic compliments and musical tributes. Anne, astute and self-preserving, maintained an air of mystery, offering no easy assurances of her affection. This restraint only deepened Henry's fascination and resolve. Their clandestine meetings took place in candlelit rooms at Hampton Court and Greenwich, where the flickering light reflected the growing intensity of their forbidden romance. Throughout the first 12 months of 1532, Henry ignored the counsel of his advisers and clergy. At last, once the Act of Succession and the Act of Supremacy were enacted, formally severing England's ties with the Roman Church, Henry wasted no time arranging a secret wedding with Anne in January 1533, even though his marriage to Catherine remained legally intact. The ceremony, held quietly at Whitehall Palace, was attended by only a handful of trusted witnesses. Legally, this marriage displaced Catherine, rendered Mary Catherine's only surviving daughter illegitimate, and elevated Anne to the status of queen. What Henry yearned for most was a male heir. Every banquet, every rite of celebration seemed orchestrated toward that singular end. Yet when Anne gave birth to Elizabeth Tudor, a beautiful baby girl, on the 7th of September 1533, Henry erupted in bitter disappointment. Exercising his absolute power, he dismissed any explanations and cast suspicion upon Anne's loyalty. The shift from admiration to distrust unfolded over mere months. By 1536, Henry had fabricated a series of heinous charges against Anne: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn, and conspiracy against the king. These accusations served as justification for the Queen's downfall. Anne's trial was swift and farcical, a mere stage play in which evidence consisted of coerced testimony and hastily produced letters. Witnesses, fearful for their own safety, either remained silent or implicated Anne to demonstrate fealty to the crown. The verdict was preordained. Anne was convicted of high treason, adultery, and plotting the king's death. On the 19th of May 1536, she was led to the scaffold at Tower Green. The executioner used a specially crafted French sword, quicker and more precise than the traditional axe. As Anne knelt, she retained her regal dignity, whispering a final prayer. The sword descended, ending the life of the woman who had once stood at the centre of Henry's world. The very next day, Henry married Jane Seymour, a gentle, pliant woman deemed more compliant. This swift, remorseless transition laid bare Henry's true nature. To him, women were merely instruments of dynastic ambition. His marriage to Anne, initially hailed as a momentous political shift, turned out to be but the prelude to a tragic sequence in which absolute power demanded the sacrifice of everything, even love and honour. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, was born circa 1508 at Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, the eldest daughter of Sir John Seymour and his wife Margaret Wentworth. From her earliest years, Jane was reared in the quiet dignity of a well-established gentry household. Her father, a knight and local magistrate, oversaw the Seymour estates with a firm but fair hand, while her mother ensured that Jane and her brothers and sisters received a proper education befitting their station. Though not schooled in the classical languages to the same depth as some courtly ladies, Jane learned to read and write English fluently and to manage household accounts, needlework, and the moral lessons of scripture skills valued more highly in a gentlewoman destined for service at court than any abstruse study of Greek philosophy. As a child, Jane grew up watching her family navigate the shifting allegiances of Tudor politics. The Seymours were related by marriage to the Boleyns, and thus shared in the favour and peril that attended Anne Boleyn's rise and fall. Jane was sent to serve as a lady-in-waiting first to Catherine of Aragon, and after Catherine's annulment, to Queen Anne herself. In the glittering, often treacherous world of the royal court, Jane distinguished herself through a serene obedience and a soft-spoken kindness. Unlike her predecessor Anne Boleyn, whose wit and ambition had drawn Henry's fierce attention, Jane's demure comportment seemed to soothe the king's restless spirit. By the summer of 1536, Henry found himself in need of a new queen, one less willful, more willing to follow his lead. Jane, ever careful to observe court etiquette and quick to offer gentle support during Henry's mourning for Anne, caught the king's eye. Their courtship, though brief compared to his long pursuit of Anne, was marked by Henry's impulsive devotion and Jane's quiet readiness to serve. She understood that her marriage to Henry was a gamble of life and death, and she prepared herself accordingly with humility, piety, and an unwavering commitment to the role of sovereign consort. On the 30th of May, 1536, just days after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry and Jane were married at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, in a modest ceremony reflective of Jane's own simplicity. There were no sumptuous tapestries or gilded coaches. Instead, the groom wore his mourning cloak, even as he wed his new bride. Jane's wedding gown, though made of fine black velvet, lacked the ostentation that had marked Anne's coronation attire. Yet in her quiet grace, she embodied the king's longing for stability and domestic peace. The following year, Jane's greatest hour arrived. On the 12th of October 1537, she gave birth to a healthy son, Edward Tudor. The birth took place at Hampton Court Palace amid prayers and fasting by court chaplains, who believed that divine favour at last smiled upon Henry's dynastic hopes. When the news reached the king, he is said to have burst into tears of pure joy, tears that the severity of his previous marriages had never drawn. For the first time, Henry felt the relief of having secured a male heir, a living guarantee that the Tudor line would endure. Yet the triumph was heartbreakingly brief. Jane's labour, though successful in delivering a prince, left her weakened. Insufficient medical knowledge of postpartum care meant that infection set in swiftly. On the 24th of October 1537, 12 days after Edward's birth, Jane Seymour succumbed to complications likely puerperal fever near Jane's lodgings at Hampton Court. As she lay dying, she reportedly expressed a final wish, that the king might look kindly on her son, and that Edward's care be entrusted to her faithful brother, Edward Seymour. The king, devastated beyond measure, declared that Jane had been the soli comforter his life. His grief was more profound even than at the death of Catherine of Aragon or the execution of Anne Boleyn, for Jane had fulfilled his deepest desire and then paid with her life. In the days following Jane's passing, Henry's court felt the chill of fear and uncertainty. The king, once again bereft of a queen, became ever more vigilant. Any deviation from his will was now seen as potential betrayal. Courtiers tiptoed through conversations, charitable gifts to the household of his infant son were scrutinized for hidden loyalties, and whispers of dissent were met with icy suspicion. Though Edward Seymour, Jane's brother, rose to become Lord Protector during the young king's minority, the memory of Jane's fate served as a grim reminder that absolute power brooked no weakness, and that, for Henry, even the gentlest of wives were dispensable once their dynastic purpose was served. After Jane Seymour's death, Henry VIII seemed poised to settle into a more measured consolidation of his reign, but social upheavals proved to awaken in him a vigilance sharper than ever. In the year 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising in the north of England, erupted as an outpouring of anger from peasants, local gentry, and devout clerics. They marched in solemn procession and knelt in prayer, protesting the crown's sweeping religious reforms and the wholesale confiscation of monastic lands. Their demands were clear: restore the monasteries, lift the crushing taxes, and release all those unjustly imprisoned under the new statutes. At first, Henry attempted to quell the rebellion with promises of pardon and redress. He sent envoys bearing assurances that their grievances would be heard, and even granted temporary reprieves. Yet when the movement swelled beyond his control, he resorted to force. He summoned loyal regiments to the north, deploying cavalry and infantry to scatter the pilgrims. Hundreds were executed in the field without trial. Villages were torched, abbey barns burned, and the property of tens of thousands of faithful confiscated. The swift brutality exacted a fearsome toll, but it also deepened Henry's paranoia. He came to believe that any flicker of dissent could blaze into the conflagration that once nearly consumed the Tudor line itself. Amid this turmoil, Thomas Cromwell, architect of the reforms and key advocate for England's break with Rome, found himself cast as the scapegoat. Cromwell had been Henry's most trusted minister, the very steward of the Act of Supremacy, the orchestrator of royal marriages, and the executor of the dissolution of the monasteries designed to replenish the royal coffers. Yet when Henry's politically arranged union with Anne of Cleves collapsed into humiliation, the king sought one on whom to pin the blame for this miscalculation. Within months, Cromwell's fall from grace was meteoric. Stripped of his offices, he was seized and imprisoned in the Tower of London. His trial, held in the year 1540, was a tragic spectacle. Vague accusations of treason and abuse of power were levelled against him. Witnesses were coerced into testimony, and the outcome was predetermined. On a grey morning at London Bridge, Cromwell ascended the scaffold, as he had once climbed the ranks of power, only now to meet the cold sweep of the executioner's sword. His head fell, and with it vanished any illusion that absolute service could shield one from royal caprice. The execution of Thomas Cromwell marked a pivotal turning point in the Tudor court. It confirmed that no minister, however devoted or capable, was safe from the king's suspicion. In the public eye, the court became akin to a dagger concealed in a velvet glove, a place of seductive politeness that concealed a readiness to strike. Nobles spoke in hushed tones of Cromwell's fate, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that any misstep, real or imagined, could invite the same swift, merciless justice. In the aftermath, the government's tone grew harsher still. Local commissioners enforcing the new religious statutes moved with ruthless efficiency, demanding oaths of loyalty, seizing chalices and vestments, and dispersing gatherings deemed heretical. The spectacle of monks dragged from their cells into the marketplace, and abbots compelled to watch their abbeys dismantled, sent a clear message. The throne would brook no challenge to its newly claimed divine authority. A pervasive fear settled over the land, colouring every prayer and every whispered conversation. For Henry, the demise of Cromwell reinforced a lesson. That power must be wielded without restraint. That loyalty must be rewarded lavishly, but also tested relentlessly. He tightened his circle of confidants, favouring those whose dependence on royal favour outweighed any capacity for independent counsel. His marriage choices, once driven by dynastic necessity, now felt tainted by the cost of political failure. Trust became the rarest currency at court, and those who once laughed at Cromwell's jokes now shook in their boots at the mere mention of his name. Thus, in the chilling wake of the Pilgrimage of Grace and the downfall of his most faithful servant, Henry VIII emerged as a monarch more isolated and more imperious than ever. His realm lay subdued by force, his advisers lived in constant dread, and the ghost of Cromwell's sword hovered over every deliberation. In the silent corners of England's halls and chapels, people learned that to serve the king was to walk a razor's edge, and that the velvet glove, once so comforting, concealed a blade that could fall at any moment. After the fall of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII resolved to prevent another political misstep from tainting his marital alliances. His fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, was born on the 22nd of September in 1515 in Duren, a city within the Duchy of Cleves in what is now western Germany. She was the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, and his wife Maria of Jülichburg, figures of modest but respectable rank in the confederation of German principalities known as the Holy Roman Empire. Anne grew up amid the relative calm of her father's court, where she received an education suited to a ducal daughter. She learned to read and write in German and French, studied the rudiments of Latin, and received instruction in etiquette, embroidery, and music. Unlike the volatile courts of France or England, the Cleves court emphasized practical governance and alliance building, and Anne's upbringing reflected those priorities. She was taught to observe the shifting allegiances of neighbouring states and to appreciate the importance of matrimonial diplomacy. Her demeanour was described by visitors as gentle and unassuming traits that contrasted sharply with the spirited severity of her predecessor, Anne Boleyn. Yet there was no hint then that Anne of Cleves would ever be thrust into the heart of English politics. In the winter of 1539, after the embarrassment of his failed union with Katherine Howard, Henry sought a German alliance to counterbalance the power of the Emperor Charles V. Encouraged by his advisers and by the prospect of strengthening ties with the Protestant princes of the empire, he agreed to a marriage treaty with Duke John of Cleves. Portraits were exchanged, most famously a flattering likeness painted by Hans Holbein, which convinced Henry that Anne was both comely and dignified. They were wed on the 6th of January, 1540, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. The ceremony was marked by pageantry befitting a royal union. Velvet banners fluttered in the winter wind, trumpets heralded the bride's arrival, and a gospel mass was sung in Latin. Yet when Henry met Anne in person for the first time, he was said to recoil in disappointment. He reportedly complained that she lacked the charm of her portrait, and that her appearance did not ignite the passions of his heart. Anne, for her part, behaved with decorum and respect, adhering to every court protocol with dutiful precision. Despite Henry's initial coldness, the marriage was consummated at least according to the official record, and for a brief time, Anne was Queen of England. They had no children together, nor was any pregnancy ever reported. In the labyrinthine Tudor politics, no son emerged from this union to bolster the dynasty, and no daughter was born to solidify the marriage. By the summer of 1540, barely 6 months after the wedding, Henry moved to have the marriage annulled. He cited a lack of mutual accommodation and claimed that he had been coerced into the alliance. The English Parliament passed an act of annexing the Kingdom of England and the Dominion of Wales to the Duchy of Cleves in a gesture that smoothed the legal process. On the 9th of July, 1540, the marriage was formally voided. Yet in a departure from his usual severity, Henry granted Anne a generous settlement, a yearly income drawn from former monastic properties, several estates in Kent and Sussex, and the perpetual title of Sister of the King. She was housed in sumptuous residences, Hever Castle, Richmond Palace, and later Chelsea Manor, where she entertained other widowed queens and retained a dignified status at court. Anne embraced her new role with grace, wearing court finery, but maintaining a respectful distance from Henry's next marriage. She never remarried and bore no children of her own. Her settlement was unique in Tudor history. Most discarded queens faced either imprisonment or worse. Anne of Cleves, by contrast, lived out her days in comfort, respected for her conduct, and even affectionately regarded by the English people. She attended royal events alongside Katherine Parr and Katherine Howard, embracing a sisterly camaraderie that transcended past alliances. In this episode of Henry's marital carousel, the case of Anne of Cleves stands out as both a political gambit and a rare example of humane treatment. The swift annulment, while exposing Henry's capriciousness, also revealed a capacity for magnanimity or pragmatism when it served his needs. Anne's life after marriage offered a quieter narrative. No tragic end, no public disgrace, but a silvered peace in lands far from her native Cleves, under the protective wing of the English crown that had so briefly claimed her as queen. Katherine Howard was born circa 1523 into the powerful Howard family of Norfolk, the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard and his wife Joyce Culpeper. As a member of this eminent dynasty, she spent her childhood at Beverley and at court residencies, where she received a rudimentary education in reading and needlework and learned the basics of courtly manners. Unlike some of her predecessors who had studied classical languages or theology, Catherine's tutors focused on household management, courtesy, and the art of conversation skills deemed essential for a young gentlewoman destined to serve among queens. Her youth was marked by lively social engagements, pageants, and dances at the palaces of Henry VIII's court. Even as a teenager, Catherine's radiant beauty, tall, slender, with golden hair and bright eyes, made her the centre of admiring glances. Her family connections afforded her positions first as a lady-in-waiting to her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, and later in the household of Queen Anne of Cleves. There, Katherine displayed a free-spirited charm and an ease of manner that caught the eye of the king himself, who was then sequestered in political disappointment over his annulled marriage. In the summer of 1540, at approximately the age of 17, Catherine's life took a dramatic turn. Henry, smitten by reports of her vivacity, arranged a secret courtship. By July the 30th of that year, barely weeks after his annulment from Anne of Cleves, he married Katherine in a simple ceremony at Oatlands Palace. Draped in scarlet and white, the Tudor colours, she stood before him as his fifth queen, her youthful laughter echoing through the oak-panelled hallways. The expectations placed upon her were immense: to provide a male heir and to secure the Tudor succession. Yet Catherine's inexperience and impetuosity led her into troubled waters. Rumours swirled that, before her royal elevation, she had engaged in flirtations and even clandestine affairs with several gentlemen of the court, including Henry Manox and Francis Dereham. These youthful indiscretions, once mere court gossip, became gravely significant when factions at court sought to undermine her. Within months of her marriage, whispered allegations grew into formal charges of adultery and treason. Though no children resulted from her union with Henry, no sons to fulfill the dynastic imperative, her past behaviour was recast as a conspiracy against the king himself. In late 1541, investigators uncovered letters and witness testimonies suggesting that Katherine had resumed an intimate relationship with Dereham after her betrothal to the king. Even more scandalous was the insinuation that she had entertained discussions of replacing Henry's bloodline to elevate a different prince, an accusation tantamount to plotting regicide. With no careful inquiry or impartial defence, Katherine was swiftly arrested and confined to the apartments at Whitehall. The king, incensed by what he regarded as her betrayal, showed no inclination toward mercy. Her trial took place in the spring of 1542, a mere 18 months after her wedding. The proceedings were a perfunctory ordeal. Evidence was sparse, witnesses were pressured, and the verdict was decided before the court convened. On the 13th of February 1542, Katherine Howard was executed on Tower Green. She was barely 19 years old. As she knelt before the executioner, she is said to have offered a trembling apology for her past and a prayer for the king's welfare. The fall of a queen so young and innocent in appearance sent shock waves through the nobility, illustrating the unforgiving nature of Tudor power. Catherine's death underscored a harsh reality at Henry's court. Proximity to the king could bring privilege and peril in equal measure. No matter her rank or her beauty, her fate reminded all that even a royal bride could be discarded at a moment's notice. In the days that followed, courtiers spoke in hushed tones of Catherine's end as a warning to maintain absolute loyalty and discretion. Gifts intended for her household were returned or redirected, and alliances that once seemed secure dissolved under fear of association. Thus, Katherine Howard's brief tenure as queen became one of the most tragic episodes of Henry VIII's reign. Her bright promise as the youngest and most captivating of his wives was extinguished by a ruthless demand for dynastic purity and the ruthless exercise of royal prerogative. In the flickering candlelight of Whitehall's galleries, the tale of Catherine's rise and fall lingered like a cautionary whisper. At Henry's court, even innocence offered no guarantee of safety. Katherine Parr was born on the 14th of August in 1512 at Parr House in Kendal, Westmoreland, the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr and his wife Maud Green. The Parr family held gentlemanly status in northern England, with estates centred around Kendal and Nash. From her earliest years, Katherine received a well-rounded education that reflected her family's humanist leanings. She studied Latin, French, and Italian, read theology and classical literature, and practiced music and embroidery. Her mother, Maud, ensured that Katherine and her siblings understood the responsibilities of landed gentry estate management, charitable obligations, and the importance of piety, while her father exposed her to the practicalities of local governance as a justice of the peace. As a young woman, Katherine served first in the household of her step-grandmother, the Countess of Salisbury, and later at the court of Princess Mary Tudor, where she honed her courtly skills and learned to navigate the subtleties of royal favour. She witnessed at close range the tumult of Henry's marital dramas, Catherine of Aragon's sorrow, Anne Boleyn's rise and fall, Jane Seymour's fleeting triumph, Anne of Cleves's annulment, and Katherine Howard's tragic end. From each queen's fate, Katherine gleaned lessons in discretion, devotion, and the perils of unchecked ambition. By the year 1543, following Katherine Howard's execution and Henry's renewed search for companionship, Katherine Parr was recommended as a prospective bride. Her reputation for moderation, her deep Protestant sympathies, and her diplomatic skill made her an ideal candidate. On the 12th of July in 1543, at Hampton Court Palace, Henry VIII married Katherine Parr in a ceremony that blended both Catholic rite and emerging Anglican, forms a nod to Catherine's own role as a bridge between Orthodox and Reformist faiths. She was approximately 31 years old at the time, a mature and composed woman compared to the youthful figures who had preceded her. Unlike Henry's previous wives, Katherine bore him no children, neither sons nor daughters. Yet she fulfilled a different dynastic function. She became stepmother to Mary, Elizabeth, and young Edward, guiding their education with a humanist zeal. She commissioned English translations of scripture and prayers, encouraged the girls to read widely, and advocated for reconciliation between her stepchildren and their overbearing father. Her household became a centre of bookish conversation, where reformist clerics and scholars debated theology under her patronage. Catherine's influence was such that she became known as the king's last nurse, tending not only to his body, but also to his legacy of faith and learning. In those final years, Henry's health and spirit were shadows of the vibrant Renaissance prince he had once been. He had grown morbidly obese, plagued by painful leg ulcers that required mechanical devices to support his weight. His mood swung unpredictably, one moment tender, the next furious without clear cause. Katherine navigated these fluctuations with tact and compassion, administering his medicines, soothing his anxieties, and subtly redirecting court politics to protect her reformist friends. Twice she faced arrest for alleged heresy, once in 1544 and again in 1546, accused of promoting Protestant doctrine too boldly. Each time, she employed her mastery of theology and her prodigious charm to deflect suspicion, securing pardons that underscored both her skill and her king's residual affection. As Henry's illness deepened, Katherine remained by his side at Windsor Castle, travelling with him from Kensington to Hampton Court to the royal sickbed. She organised daily services in English, compiled consolation books for the ailing king, and oversaw the regimen of doctors and nurses. In Miranda, the king's final days were marked by delirium and pain, yet Catherine's steady presence offered a measure of peace. On the 24th of November, in 1546, Catherine performed the last rites in private, praying for Henry's soul as his breath grew faint. After Henry's death on the 28th of January in 1547, Catherine emerged from the shadow of the Tudor court remarkably unscathed. She retained her lands and her status as Queen Dowager, although she never again sat at a royal throne. 2 years later, in 1549, she married her longtime friend and counsellor, Thomas Seymour, Lord Seymour of Sudeley. Tragically, Catherine's life ended on the 5th of September in 1548, shortly after giving birth to her only child, Lady Mary Seymour. She died at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, reputed to have said on her deathbed that she was ready to meet her maker. Katherine Parr's tenure as Henry's sixth queen thus combined survival, influence, and compassion. She navigated the perils of court intrigue with a blend of scholarship and grace, secured the education and welfare of her stepchildren, and managed to maintain her integrity amid the brutality of Tudor politics. In the quiet aftermath of her brief marriage, she left behind a legacy of moderation, learning, and humanity, proof that even in an era of swift executions and shattered alliances, a queen could wield her gentle authority to shape the kingdom's future and protect its heirs with unwavering devotion. By the years 1544 to 1546, Henry VIII had truly become a monstrous figure in both form and temperament. His once athletic frame had swollen beyond recognition. Chronic overeating and near-total lack of exercise had pushed his weight to an estimated 500 pounds or more, nearly 230 kilograms, rendering him virtually unable to stand or walk without aid. His doublet, once tailored to accentuate broad shoulders, now strained at every seam. It required specially commissioned panels of heavy black cloth and extra padding to accommodate his girth. Breeches had to be cut in a semicircle behind. No ordinary hose could stretch around his calves, which were so inflamed and distended that they resembled tree trunks. His boots were custom-built on platform soles to support his weight, and he wore them indoors as well as out, leaving polished wooden tracks across the parquet floors of Whitehall. Each morning began late, often not until 9 o'clock, when servants would bring him a breakfast of venison sausages, thick slices of sugar-glazed ham, and chalices of spiced wine. His dining table, a vast slab of oak, groaned under tureens of stewed eels, platters of roasted fowl, and bowls of sugared almonds. After the meal, he would recline in a cushioned chair, his legs elevated on footstools to ease the throbbing pain caused by massive leg ulcers. These wounds, infected and foul-smelling, wept pus, and required frequent bandaging by the court surgeons. The stench was so overpowering that the walls of his chamber were draped with linen tapestries soaked in lavender water, and the windows were kept closed day and night to contain the odour. By midday, he sometimes attempted brief audiences, but his attendants dared not remain in the same room for more than a few minutes. His breathing was laboured. Every exhalation sounded like wind through a broken pipe. He suffered from bouts of gout so excruciating that he would howl and grip the arms of his chair, sweat beading on his brow, while courtiers watched helplessly. His tongue, coated thickly by the body's metabolic imbalance, made him speak in slurred, gravelly tones. Any slight delay in meal service or perceived insolence could trigger sudden eruptions of rage. Doors would slam, goblets would shatter, and favoured ministers would tremble, lest they be next in line for a necktie or a swift fall from grace. As afternoon sun waned, Henry often dozed in his chamber, lulled by the rhythm of soft chants from a hand-held portative organ played by a court musician. His nap might stretch into the early evening, at which point servants would rouse him for supper, a second banquet of roast swan, almond porridge, and pastries oozing with honey. He favoured sweet dishes, believing sugar a balm for his troubled stomach, though in truth it worsened his obesity and fed the insidious spread of his diseased flesh. At night, he required mechanical devices, pulleys and straps to raise him from his chair and lower him into his deathbed-sized canopy, which was reinforced with iron rings to support extra mattresses and bolsters. The bedchamber's floors were carpeted thickly to muffle his weighty movements, and guards stood on either side of his four-poster, wary of the creaking timbers. His sleep was fitful, Nightmares of rebellion and betrayal often drove him to rouse his attendants with frantic demands for more torches or the immediate delivery of a counsellor's head. This extreme physical decline coincided with a mental retreat into paranoia. Henry suspected any smile as masking dissent, any respectful bow as prelude to a knife in his back. His relationship with his children Mary, Elizabeth and Edward grew strained. Edward, now a young teenaged king in all but name, saw his father only in short, supervised visits. Mary and Elizabeth, alternately restored and then bastardized by royal decree, were used as pawns in religious negotiations. Their presence at court fluctuated with Henry's shifting alliances. Family affection had been supplanted by political calculation. Even a daughter's embrace could be interpreted as plotting to seize the throne. Meanwhile, foreign ambassadors whispered of England as a kingdom of madness. Venetian envoys recorded their horror at the sight of a sovereign so consumed by his own flesh that his court resembled a hospital more than a palace. They described corridors thick with the odour of infected ulcers, nobles inching along walls to avoid the stench, and a king whose decrees were unpredictable as a storm. France and the Holy Roman Empire balked at treaties, fearful of treating with a monarch whose grip on his own faculties and his body seemed slipping by the day. England's reputation among European powers suffered. Where once treaties had been seized with relief, now they were negotiated with trepidation and suspicion. Thus, in those final years, Henry VIII's obesity fused with his tyranny to fashion an image of a monster king, one who ruled not from a golden throne, but from a sickbed encircled by dread. His court became a theatre of fear, where every feast announced and every council summoned carried the implicit threat of a swift and dreadful end for those who displeased him. And as the candles guttered in his private chapel, even his own prayers were laced with the desperation of a man who had consumed himself with power and was consumed in turn by the very body he had failed to master. Henry VIII's later years were defined by a litany of ailments that transformed him from the vigorous prince of his youth into a frail, tormented monarch. Beyond the well-documented obesity and leg ulcers, he suffered from chronic gout, a condition so excruciating that it immobilized his joints and forced him to rely on chamber pots and raised seating. His gout attacks often flared in the dead of night, leaving him writhing in agony, clutching at the wooden arms of his throne and screaming for relief. Physicians of the era, limited by the rudiments of medieval medicine, prescribed poultices of boiled cabbage leaves, bloodletting with leeches, and enemas made from turpentine and wine. These measures provided little respite and often worsened his weakness by bleeding him of vital fluids. Compounding the gout was a relentless case of sciatica, which brought shooting pains from his lower back down to his legs, further restricting his ability to stand. The result was a monarch who spent most of his waking hours reclined on a series of bolstered chairs or strapped into a wheeled litter. His internecine life of excess also exposed him to frequent episodes of dysentery, likely contracted during travels or through contaminated food. On some occasions, his retinue reported that the king was too feverish and dehydrated to attend mass for weeks at a time. The court's physicians, juggling multiple patients suffering the same fate, kept careful but futile records of his fevers, prescribing iron and raw egg yolks to fortify the blood. Yet Henry's body continued to betray him. By the year 1545, his hairline had receded, and his once ruddy complexion had taken on a pallid, waxen hue. Rumours circulated among courtiers that he also displayed symptoms of diabetes, unquenchable thirst, paired with frequent urination, though no chronicler could confirm a diagnosis. Kidney stones, too, were a likely affliction, causing him to brace his breath and groan during courtly audiences. Each time he crossed the threshold of his privy chamber or was hoisted into his sedan chair, the clang of metal supports and the hiss of attendants' whispers echoed through Whitehall's corridors. The court itself became a place of muted dread. Nobles tiptoed along the outer halls, their silken petticoats rustling as they passed by the tapestries stained with medicinal balms. They took turns presenting petitions at odd hours, fearing that any delay might be construed as disrespect. Ladies in waiting carried flasks of rosewater and lavender to dab at the king's brow, while physicians hovered at the foot of his bed, their satchels bulging with unguents and crucibles. Pages shuffled parchment scrolls detailing new symptoms: the king's sleep apnea, his laboured breathing, his night terrors in which he raged against invisible foes, social rituals adapted around his infirmities. Jousts and masquerades gave way to private concerts, where lute and virginal music accompanied the king's nodding head. Dining halls were refitted with reclining couches in place of benches, and long tables were replaced by small stands that could be wheeled beside his throne. Court festivals were shortened, and sundown processes replaced midnight revels to accommodate his need for rest. Even the council chamber, once a site of rigorous debate, became a circular gallery through which Henry could be borne on a litter, listening as councillors spoke in hushed tones. Political manoeuvring thrived in this atmosphere of vulnerability. Ambitious nobles whispered that a dying king would soon appoint a protector, and plots fermenting in shadowed alcoves bore the risk of sudden arrest. Every cough or gasp from the royal bed was reported to the Privy Council, prompting emergency meetings by candlelight. Invitations to dine with the king were coveted for the favour they promised, but also feared for the possibility that lingering too long might incur the displeasure of a capricious sovereign. Foreign emissaries, dispatched by France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain, found themselves met not by a youthful king in full regalia, but by a gaunt figure in a high-collared doublet, supported by attendants on either side. They recorded in their journals the accoutrements of his illness. A silver flask of rosehip tea clutched in his hand, a linen handkerchief pressed to his mouth to stifle the odour of gangrene, and a solemn hush that fell over the hall whenever he wheezed. They spoke of England as a realm teetering on the brink of change, its pivoting dynastic wheel slowed by a ruler broken in body and spirit. Thus, Henry's diseases wove themselves into the fabric of Tudor governance. His body became a vessel of both pity and power, a reminder that even the mightiest king was subject to the ravages of flesh. In those final seasons, as his court adjusted to each new malady, England watched and feared the fading of its once legendary monarch, whose decline presaged the end of an era. Henry VIII's final days unfolded in the draughty chambers of Windsor Castle, where the winter air seeped through the stone walls and the scent of antiseptic poultices mingled with the tang of torch smoke. By this time, his sixth wife, Katherine Parr, had become both nurse and companion, tending his every need with gentle hands and calm resolve. Katherine Parr remained at Henry VIII's side as his strength ebbed away in the chill of Windsor Castle's stone chambers. Propped upon a mountain of silken cushions, the king lay swathed in heavy tapestries to stifle the stench of his festering leg ulcers and medicated dressings. Around him gathered his three surviving children: Mary, now in her late 20s and restored to the title of princess; Elizabeth, 13 years of age, and still known as the Lady Elizabeth; and Edward, his 10-year-old son, formally invested as Prince of Wales but not yet king. Every morning, Catherine knelt beside the bed to read from the Great Bible in English, her calm voice weaving prayers for mercy and guidance. Edward sat at the foot of the bed, clutching a small psalter, his dark curls brushing against the patina of polished oak. Though he wore the crimson mantle of his princely office, Edward looked more a schoolboy than a ruler, his wide eyes reflecting both reverence and perplexity at the spectacle of his father's decline. Mary, dressed in sombre black velvet, fingered her rosary as she prayed quietly in the shadow of a flickering torch. Elizabeth, whose scholarly pursuits had earned her her father's cautious respect, leafed through a devotional manuscript gifted by Catherine, pausing occasionally to read aloud a verse. As midday approached, the court physician, a portly Spaniard named Dr. Antonio Vicentino, entered bearing a leather pouch of powders and scented waters. He bent over Henry's heaving chest, prodded a gouty ankle, then sprinkled a concoction of rue and powdered pearls upon the bandages. The king winced and drew a ragged breath, his glazed eyes flickering with pain. Nearby, a pair of attendants lifted cushions beneath his legs, elevating them to relieve the agony of his leg ulcers, a hideous mixture of necrosis and infection that wept a foul-smelling ichor. By afternoon, the chamber doors opened to admit a procession of nobles, each offering obeisance. The Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, knelt to receive the king's final directives. Henry, though barely able to speak above a rasp, managed to whisper that Edward should be raised in the new Anglican faith and taught to uphold the realm's laws. He made Catherine promise to protect his children's futures, particularly Edward's transition from prince to monarch. Mary, who had endured demotions and reconciliations, pressed her gloved hand to his, and Elizabeth offered a curtsy that betrayed tears in her bright eyes. As dusk fell, the massive candles in wrought iron sconces burned low, casting a golden haze over the chamber. Katherine signalled for the windows to be closed, sealing in the warmth and the scent of medicinal lavender. The children gathered at their father's bedside. Edward curled his small, trembling hand around Henry's. Mary laid a velvet cloak across his legs, and Elizabeth whispered a comforting psalm. Outside, the castle corridors fell silent, save for the distant murmur of guards. That evening, Henry's breathing grew shallower. The king's chamberlain, dressed in sable, presented a goblet of cooled claret wine, which Henry sipped with great effort. Katherine knelt to steady his hand, murmuring words of scripture. Edward watched, his heart pounding, as each breath grew fainter. Mary recited the litany of saints, her voice quivering but resolute. Elizabeth placed her cheek against the king's shoulder, whispering promises that he would rest peacefully. Near midnight, Henry's raspy wheezes slowed to a whisper. Katherine gathered his other hand, pressing it gently. Mary and Elizabeth joined in a final prayer, their voices blending in the dim light. Edward, still clutching his psalter, repeated a prayer he had learned under Katherine's guidance. Moments later, Henry VIII exhaled deeply one last time. His chest relaxed, and his faded, once regal face softened like a setting Sunday. All three children remained at his side until Katherine gave a respectful nod. Edward, scarcely able to stand, was helped from the bedside by attendants. Mary dabbed his brow with a damp cloth, and Elizabeth laid the devotional book atop the bed. As the life left Henry's body, the hush of Windsor Castle enveloped them princess, and prince, bound together in a moment of profound silence and irreversible change. On the 28th of January in 1547, at the age of 56 years, Henry VIII drew his final breath within the shadowed walls of Windsor Castle. His once mighty frame, bloated to grotesque proportions, lay motionless upon a bed, strewn with damask and velvet. The chronic stench of his festering leg ulcers still lingered in the chamber, even after the tapestries soaked in lavender had been replaced. In the days before his passing, he had issued his last grim decree, the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a testament to the unrelenting cruelty he wielded until the end. In his dying hour, the king's breathing had grown shallow and rasping. Servants hovered at the foot of the bed, ready to catch any whispered command. Courtiers assembled in hushed clusters outside the chamber, their fine cloaks rustling like distant wings. Within, Katherine Parr, his steadfast sixth queen, knelt beside him, her fingers pressed to his wrist, still warm with faded life. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, stood silent nearby, clutching her rosary. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, gripped the edge of a cushion, her dark eyes glassy with unshed tears. Young Edward, the Prince of Wales, too small to shoulder the weight of his own grief, watched in wide-eyed reverence as his father's spirit slipped away. With the king's death, the great Tudor era, forged in blood and ambition, came to its sombre close. The banners of the red rose and the white rose, once united in Henry's lineage, now drooped in mourning. The crown, its gemstones dulled by the hands that had worn it so fiercely, passed to Edward VI, a boy of 9, whose fragile innocence stood in stark contrast to his father's iron will. Though Edward was proclaimed king in the Grand Chapel of St. George's, his youth and frailty meant that true power would reside in the hands of regents. In the Grand Hall of Windsor, the court went into immediate preparation for the funeral. The royal wardrobe unfolded rolls of cloth of gold and sable fur to clothe the body, shaping the king's form into a final, silent monument. His alabaster effigy was carved to rest upon the bier, clad in coronation robes. A crown of red velvet perched upon his head. Around the chamber, tapestries depicting the Tudor heraldry were lowered to half-mast, and candles were arranged in quartets to cast a trembling light upon the king's likeness. On the 6th of February in 1547, a funeral procession wound through the frost-bitten streets of Windsor. The bier, drawn by 12 milk-white horses draped in black velvet, passed under triumphal arches adorned with the king's arms. Gentlemen ushers in mourning cloaks preceded the cortege, bearing torches whose flames danced in the early dusk. Among them marched Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, now Lord Protector, his face drawn and grave. Close behind walked Mary and Elizabeth, each veiled in mourning silk, their carriage following at a respectful distance. Edward VI, wrapped in crimson velvet, rode beside the Duke in a gilded litter, his small hand gripping a tufted cushion. As the procession reached Street, George's Chapel, the choir intoned the Requiem in Latin, voices rising in echo beneath the vaulted roof. The stone walls, witness to years of royal splendour and sorrow, seemed to absorb the mournful strains. Mary dropped to her knees, pressing her forehead against the cold floor, while Elizabeth crossed herself in a gesture learned from her mother's Catholic rites. Edward, too young to grasp the full weight of the liturgy, bowed his head in imitation, his tears falling onto the lush carpet. The king's body lay in state within the choir, draped in opulent cloth of estate, his hands joined in silent benediction. Noblemen filed past, offering curtsies and genuflections, each mindful of the legacy Henry left, a treasury drained by wars and lavish court life, a realm rent by religious upheaval, and a succession secured yet fraught with peril. Outside, commoners gathered behind barricades, craning for a glimpse of the monarch who had shaped their world, for better and for worse. When the service concluded, Henry's remains were interred in a marble tomb, bearing his recumbent effigy, hand-painted and gilded to preserve his regal visage. Above the tomb hung a gilt canopy, its crest of Tudor roses a silent reminder of the dynasty that had forged England's destiny. Katherine Parr, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward each laid a wreath of white lilies upon the coffin, symbols of purity and farewell. In the days that followed, the kingdom adjusted to life without Henry's overshadowing presence. Edward VI, under the stewardship of his protector and regents, assumed the throne that would shape the next phase of the Reformation. Mary would later restore, then forfeit, the old faith in her own turbulent reign. Elizabeth would emerge as a monarch of her own making, navigating the religious and political storms that her father had unleashed. But on that cold February morning at Windsor, as winter's breath lingered upon the castle grounds, it was the end of Henry VIII's reign and the beginning of an uncertain new era in the land he had both ruled and ravaged. Edward VI, the only surviving son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, ascended the throne at the tender age of 9 in January 1547. Too young to govern, he reigned in name only while the real power lay in the hands of regents first, his maternal uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who acted as Lord Protector, and later John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, who became Duke of Northumberland. These two men, both ambitious and cunning, vied for influence over the boy king and the direction of the realm. Factions formed around them, each seeking to steer policy and gain favour. Courtiers whispered of bribes and secret councils held in the dead of night. Somerset, a champion of moderate Protestant reforms, pushed to continue the ecclesiastical changes begun by his brother's father. He moved to revise the Book of Common Prayer and to dissolve remaining chantries, arguing that those funds would better serve the poor. Yet his heavy-handed approach and perceived nepotism alienated many nobles, who accused him of enriching his own family. Northumberland, sensing an opportunity, rallied opposition by presenting himself as a defender of stability and order, promising to curb Somerset's excesses. The resulting power struggle veered between open confrontation duels of words in the Privy Council and covert intrigue, as both regents sought to build networks of loyal supporters across the court and county. Meanwhile, the royal sisters lived in uneasy limbo. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had once been declared illegitimate during her father's controversial divorce, but was restored to her position by Henry's final will. Yet her staunch Catholic faith made her suspect in the eyes of Protestant regents. She spent much of Edward's reign in isolation at Hatfield House, reading her missals and praying for the return of the old religion. Her attendants brought her news of Edward's reforms, abolition of clerical celibacy, removal of Latin liturgy, but she refused to be reconciled, quietly plotting the recovery of her mother's church. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, fared only slightly better. Although Henry had once proclaimed her a princess, her legitimacy had been revoked and restored more than once. During Edward's reign, she was kept at court but watched closely for any sign of political activity. She studied theology and classical languages, and often lobbied for her own patronage, but her status remained delicate. Neither sister found a stable place in the court's hierarchy. Mary's piety earned her reverence among Catholics, while Elizabeth's intellect attracted reformers. Both knew that their security rested not on birthright alone, but on the volatile tide of factional fortune. Edward VI's reign lasted only 6 years. In July 1553, he fell gravely ill, likely from tuberculosis or a similar wasting disease. As his health declined, Northumberland manoeuvred to control the succession. Edward, determined to prevent the throne passing to his half-sister Mary, and thus undoing Protestant gains, drafted a device naming his cousin Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Jane, the 9-day queen, was swept onto the throne upon Edward's death in July 1553, but her hold was tenuous. Mary proclaimed her rightful claim, rallied the nobility and common folk with promises to restore Catholicism, and marched south. Jane's supporters melted away, and within days Mary seized power. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London and later executed, a tragic casualty of dynastic conflict. Mary's triumph marked a bloody resurgence of Catholicism. She restored papal authority and burned nearly 300 Protestant heretics at the stake, earning her the grim moniker Bloody Mary. Bishops and clergy who had married under Edward's reforms were deposed. Churches returned to the Latin Mass. Monasteries, long disbanded, remained in ruin. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, though politically motivated, alienated many English subjects and furthered fears of foreign domination. Mary's death in November 1558 after a 4-year reign opened the path for Elizabeth I. As Queen, Elizabeth reinstated a moderate Protestant settlement, navigating between extremes with the Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559. Yet the legacy of rapid, successive religious reversals haunted her reign. Nobles and clergy, conditioned by Edward's reforms, Mary's persecutions, and Elizabeth's cautious approach, remained wary of zealots on both sides. Protestant Puritans pressed for further change. Catholic recusants plotted rebellions and foreign invasions. The social fabric, strained by decades of uncertainty, bore deep scars. Elizabeth's 45-year reign brought stability and cultural flowering, but the religious and political fractures sown in Edward's 6-year tenure persisted. The memory of shifting allegiances, of sisters pitted against one another by royal whim, and of regents wielding power behind child kings, instilled a lasting caution in English politics. Future monarchs learned to temper their authority or risk the same fate as their predecessors. Thus, the Tudor sequence Edward's brief rule, Mary's fierce counter-revolution, Elizabeth's measured middle road etched patterns of cautious governance and religious compromise into the soul of England, shaping a national character that prized moderation and the rule of law, wary of the extremes that had nearly torn the realm apart. Henry VIII not only left an indelible mark on England's domestic affairs, but also transformed the nation's standing on the European stage. During his lifetime, he engaged in multiple campaigns against France, most notably over the possession of Calais, and he deftly balanced alliances with the Holy Roman Empire to contain Habsburg ambitions. Yet his decision to break from Rome cast England as a pariah among the great Catholic powers. The Pope in Rome, alongside rulers of Spain, France, and the Italian city-states, viewed England as a religious renegade, forcing Henry to face mounting isolation. After his death, the repercussions of this unilateral religious policy lingered. England became known as the Schismatic Kingdom, a state whose faith shifted at the monarch's whim. Ambassadors arriving in London recorded scenes of monastic lands being seized by royal commissioners, abbey buildings demolished, and clergy forced to celebrate secret masses in hidden chapels. Catholic rituals, Latin masses, the veneration of saints, the use of holy water were outlawed, replaced by Anglican services composed under royal authority. Priests and laypeople alike were compelled to swear new oaths of allegiance, acknowledging the king as head of the Church of England and renouncing papal supremacy. Diplomatic relations with Europe's major powers quickly soured. France, suspicious of England's unpredictable religious swings and fearful that Protestant refugees might foment unrest along its northern border, curbed its willingness to negotiate treaties. Spain, Henry's former ally through Catherine of Aragon, withdrew military support and denounced England in the papal curia. The Holy Roman Emperor, though sympathetic to the cause of reformation in some German principalities, hesitated to extend full backing to a kingdom deemed heretical. And the Vatican formally condemned the Tudor regime as heretical, excommunicating the king and forbidding Catholic rulers from recognizing his ecclesiastical authority. Facing this diplomatic impasse, England turned to new relationships among the Protestant states of northern Europe. Ambassadors and merchants cultivated ties with the Netherlands, whose provinces were themselves chafing under Habsburg Catholic rule, and with the Lutheran princes of the German lands. These alliances, though less financially lucrative than the old Catholic confederations, offered a lifeline of trade and political cooperation. English wool found markets in Brabant. Dutch ships carried English cloth to the Baltic. In return, English financiers invested in Hanseatic ports, and skilled artisans from the Rhineland settled in London, bringing continental techniques in brewing, printing, and metallurgy. This process of breaking free from Roman Catholicism and constructing the Church of England began as Henry's personal bid to secure a male heir, but it had far-reaching consequences. Over time, it forged a distinct national church that blended political expedience with liturgical innovation. The Anglican Church became an instrument of state power. Monarchs appointed bishops, controlled church revenues, and dictated doctrine. Yet it also retained elements of medieval Catholic worship, such as bishops in robes, the use of incense in some cathedrals, and an emphasis on the sacraments. Under the Tudor successors, this hybrid church continued to evolve. Edward VI's regency moved toward further Protestant reforms, stripping away images and instituting a simplified liturgy. Mary I attempted to reinstate papal authority, only to see the realm swing back under Elizabeth I to a middle way via media that sought to reconcile tradition with the authority of Scripture. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 cemented the Church of England's identity. The monarch as supreme governor, the English Book of Common Prayer in place of the Latin Missal, and a theological framework that acknowledged both Protestant doctrine and episcopal structure. Despite continuing disputes, Puritans pressing for more radical changes, recusant Catholics clinging to old rites, the church that Henry began remained the national faith. Its existence underpinned the notion of sovereign independence. No foreign pontiff could dictate the spiritual life of the realm. Over the centuries, this principle of national ecclesiastical autonomy became a cornerstone of English identity and a model for later Protestant nations. Thus, Henry VIII's personal motivations, his quest for a son, and his refusal to accept any higher authority than himself set in motion a religious revolution. It isolated England from its former Catholic allies, drove new partnerships with Protestant neighbours, and established a unique church framework that endured through storm and strife. While the immediate aftermath saw England navigating precarious alliances and facing the hostility of powerful Catholic states, the long-term outcome was the rise of a distinct Anglican tradition, one that blended vestiges of medieval piety with the emerging currents of Reformation theology. In forging this path, Henry VIII laid the groundwork for a sovereign church, an emblem of national unity and royal supremacy that would define English religious life for centuries to come. The reign of Henry VIII unleashed profound economic and social upheavals. The dissolution of the monasteries and the wholesale sale of former church lands initially swelled the royal coffers with a vast fortune, yet that wealth was managed haphazardly. Courtiers and royal officials eagerly snapped up these parcels at rock-bottom prices, consolidating estates into ever larger holdings. The newly empowered gentry, those landowners who had once occupied a middling status, grew in influence as they leased out tracts of pasture and arable fields for profit. By marshalling rentals and imposing fines, they enriched themselves while hollowing out the traditional communal structures that had supported village life for centuries. For the rural poor, the consequences were dire. Rising rents and burdensome tithe-like taxes on both land and produce forced many tenant farmers into penury. Fields that had once been held in common were now enclosed by stout hedgerows, cutting off grazing rights and access to woodlands. With limited means to sustain themselves, families abandoned their ancestral cottages and trudged toward burgeoning towns. This rural exodus fueled an expansion of the urban labour market, and a boom in craft industries, cloth weaving, metalwork, and leatherworking flourished. But it also unleashed overcrowding and squalor. Narrow alleyways filled with makeshift hovels, and workhouses struggled to absorb the flood of job seekers. Though the sporadic uprisings, village riots over enclosures or grain shortages were smaller in scale than the Pilgrimage of Grace, they served as persistent reminders of the social toll exacted by a policy implemented in haste. Culturally, the eradication of hundreds of monastic libraries and scriptoria cost England countless manuscripts and devotional art. Illuminated breviaries, copies of the works of St. Augustine, and tapestries depicting the life of Christ were sold off, burned for their bindings, or left to decay in abandoned cloisters. Yet, paradoxically, the Tudor court also championed the spread of printed learning. New schoolbooks and English translations of the Bible, once forbidden, now circulated in both grammar schools and the homes of merchants. The Actes and Monuments, Fox's Book of Martyrs, achieved a wide readership, embedding reformist narratives in the public mind. Oxford and Cambridge received royal grants to expand lecture halls, attracting scholars from Europe, though the lion's share of patronage still favoured sons of noble and gentry families. Commoners, lacking funds for tuition, were largely excluded from these academic advances. By the end of Henry's reign, England had shifted from its feudal, agrarian roots toward an early form of capitalism. The gentry class, enriched through monastic acquisitions, invested in proto-industrial ventures, water-powered mills, vineyards, and cloth manufacturing houses sprung up across the South and Midlands. Merchant guilds in cities like London, Bristol, and Norwich negotiated trading privileges abroad, exporting woolen cloth to Antwerp and Hamburg. Yet these gains were unevenly distributed. Peasants struggled under high leasehold rents. Artisans faced fierce competition and periodic unemployment. And the Crown's treasury, drained by Henry's military ambitions, often resorted to heavy taxation during peacetime. In the half-century following the King's death, these economic and cultural transformations set England on a new trajectory. The remnants of monastic charity, once the safety net for the sick, the elderly, and the poor, had vanished, to be replaced by more formalized poor laws under later monarchs. Urban guilds assumed some social welfare functions, but the spectre of beggary haunted every market square. Meanwhile, the diffusion of printed materials fostered a rising literacy rate among tradesmen and shopkeepers, laying groundwork for more informed civic discourse. Thus, the England that emerged from Henry VIII's turbulent era was a land in flux, its old communal bonds unravelled, its economy diversified, its culture democratized through the printed word. The hollowing out of medieval institutions and the rise of market-driven land ownership created fertile ground for the great changes of the 17th century. Civil war, religious dissent, and the eventual flowering of the Enlightenment. In those quiet dawns after long Tudor nights, the fields and towns of England stirred with possibilities born of upheaval, an England transformed, and yet haunted by the ghosts of its monastic past. The funeral of Henry VIII was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, yet it was far from the solemn spectacle the court had anticipated. His body, swollen to grotesque proportions by the ravages of disease and obesity, lay in state within the chapel's choir, wrapped in royal vestments that strained at every seam. Even before the service began, the stench of decay permeated the air, a heady blend of rotting flesh and desiccated wound dressings that clung to velvet drapes and clotted candles. Courtiers exchanged uneasy glances, their finely embroidered doublets and gowns ill-prepared for the assault on their senses. According to whispered tales, when the hearse set out from London on its journey to Windsor, the cold winter air caused the late king's corpse to expand further. The wooden bier, expertly crafted yet underprepared for so great a bulk, cracked along its edges. Mists of foul liquor dripped through the splintering boards, leaving dark, damp streaks upon the cobblestones as the procession moved slowly along the Frost Hill Road. The horses, shod in their finest silver-tacked harnesses, recoiled at the smell, while mourners hurried to cover their noses with handkerchiefs steeped in rosewater. Commoners lining the route did not weep. Many stood motionless, mouths agape, as they bore witness to the nightmarish sight of a king who had ruled with iron will, now reduced to a leaking, bursting vessel. Inside St. George's, the officiating bishops and priests found themselves in an awkward reversal of loyalties. Though Henry himself had severed England's allegiance to Rome, the funeral rites called for a brief return to the old Catholic Mass. The Gospel was intoned in Latin, incense wafting in heavy clouds, and the Litany of the Saints was chanted in unison. Yet the clergy, attired in sumptuous chasubles and mitres, performed each gesture with trembling haste. They crossed themselves and sprinkled holy water over the bier, their vestments stained by drops of fluid that bore the unmistakable odour of putrefaction. At the conclusion of the rite, they hurried from the chapel doors, faces pale and hands pressed to their noses, as though fleeing some unseen plague. The crowd that gathered outside was drawn not by piety but by morbid curiosity. Word had spread of the king's corpulent corpse of flesh bloating in the cold, of joints stiff with infection, of skin split open like overripe fruit. Families pressed their children to their shoulders to catch a glimpse of the monstrous remains of the monarch who had ordered so many executions. Murmurs rippled through the throng. Some spoke of divine retribution, others of cautionary morality. Street corner vendors sold sugared almonds and cupfuls of warm ale, charging a penny apiece for a better vantage point. The entire scene resembled a carnival of horrors more than a funeral cortege. Legend holds that, as the hearse approached the chapel steps, a final crack sounded the bier. Under its ghastly burden, splintered once more, allowing a small pool of discoloured fluid to seep onto the stone pavement. The horses balked and reared, coaches behind ground to a shuddering halt, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Then, with grim determination, the pallbearers lifted what remained of the coffin and carried it within, the congregation parting to let the macabre procession pass. In the days that followed, ballads and poems emerged celebrating and mocking the funeral's grotesquerie. Broadside sheets circulated in market towns, illustrating the scene in crude woodcuts. A bloated king, a shattering coffin, a procession halted by filth. Minstrels sang satirical verses about the swollen sovereign of Windsor, recounting how no clout could staunch the flow, and how even royal robes and bands could not contain the woe. These popular accounts travelled far beyond England's shores, appearing in French broadsheets and German chapbooks, often accompanied by dramatic retellings of the funereal calamity. The story of Henry's body bursting en route became a stark emblem of nature's final judgment on human pride. Scholars and scribes later observed that this anecdote, however exaggerated, served as a cautionary fable. No matter how absolute a ruler's power, mortality ultimately reduces us all to the same fate. In villages across the realm, mothers would hush restless children with tales of the bloated king, warning them to obey moral laws lest their own bodies betray them in death. In taverns, toasts were raised to earth reclaiming what all men must yield, and in chancelleries, courtiers cited the incident when advising young nobles to temper ambition with humility. Thus, the funeral of Henry VIII, intended as a grand affirmation of Tudor majesty, became, instead, a spectral drama of decay and delirium. The chapel of St. George's, where monarchs had once been crowned with hope, echoed with the memory of a coronation undone by the final undoing of its subject. And in that dismal procession, stitched into the very fabric of England's collective memory, lay the most potent reminder that even kings, clothed in velvet and crowned with gold, cannot escape the grave's dark dominion. Henry VIII left England with a legacy of turmoil. The firm ground of royal authority had been worn away, religion sundered into hostile camps, the economy thrust into rapid transformation, yet lacking stability, and society ripped between prosperity and dire hardship. He had founded the Church of England, opening the way for the sequence of Protestant reforms, yet he also instigated merciless religious violence. The string of executions of statesmen, queens, and clergy cast a fearful shadow over the monarchy, shaking the foundations of loyalty across the realm. Over the long term, Henry's religious reforms and ruthless policies laid the groundwork for the sectarian conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries. The realm he reshaped would later fracture in the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651, a brutal confrontation between Crown and Parliament that drew stark lines between Puritan and Anglican, Presbyterian and Catholic. Henry's assertion of national religious sovereignty, his severance from Rome, became the forerunner of the principle that the state's authority must supersede any foreign ecclesiastical power. This became a cornerstone of modern nationalism and the concept of state sovereignty, influencing the legal structures that define nations to this day. Yet the cost was immense. Thousands perished in burnings at the stake, scaffoldings and secret trials. The flow of blood and the echo of cleaving swords stained the notion of divine right with terror. Parishioners who had once knelt to chant the Latin Mass now faced fines, imprisonment, or worse for continuing to speak in whispered prayers. Monastic alms that sustained the old and the poor were extinguished almost overnight, driving the dispossessed into squalid workhouses or onto the roads as beggars. The social contract was rent. Communities learned to guard their words and eyes, for a moment's dissent could bring ruin. Legally, the Act of Supremacy established a template for national law that placed the monarch above any external religious authority. This radical notion that the crown could dictate matters of faith resonated across Europe as rulers in France, Spain, and Scandinavia reconsidered the balance between church and state. In England, it fostered a litany of statutes that bound religious conformity to the realm's laws: recusancy fines for Catholics, compulsory attendance at Anglican services, and oaths of loyalty that tested the conscience. Subsequent monarchs, from Edward VI's further Protestant reforms to Mary's Catholic restoration, and finally Elizabeth's search for a via media, all built upon the structure Henry had erected, sometimes reinforcing it, sometimes bending it. Henry's story endures as a dire lesson on the nature of ambition and power. When one man assumes himself the absolute pinnacle of earthly authority, and when religion is manipulated for personal ends, society pays a bitter price in violence, division, and crisis. The machine of the state, once harnessed to serve a dynastic vision, has a way of consuming the very hands that guide it. Henry's executions, dissolutions, and excommunications taught a generation that no one prince or pauper was safe from the caprice of a sovereign unbound by higher moral constraints. Modern observers still recall Henry VIII as one of history's most terrifying monarchs, not merely for his notorious beheadings and starved skulls in London Bridge's rackets, but for the deeper warning his reign embodies. His life illustrates the imperative to check the excesses of power, to uphold conscience and the rule of law, and to recognize that the mightiest authority must never be vested unquestioningly in a single individual. For every statute he enacted, every altar he dismantled, every head rolled beneath the executioner's sword, the realm learned that unbridled ambition and unchecked authority sow only seeds of discord and ruin, fracturing the social fabric in ways that echo through the ages.